There is a question I've been asked more times than I can count, usually by someone sitting across from me who has done everything right. They walk, they eat reasonably well, they sleep adequately, they take their medications, they go to their appointments. By every conventional measure of healthy aging, they are doing what they're supposed to do. And still, something is changing. The strength they expected to maintain is quietly leaving. The recovery that used to be automatic now takes longer. The body that was supposed to respond to the signals they were sending is responding, but not as fully as the effort seems to warrant, and they want to know why. I used to look for the answer in the obvious places: sleep quality, protein intake, the specific nature of their movement, whether the signal they were sending was consistent enough, specific enough, believable enough for the body to act on. Sometimes I found it there, but sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I sat across from a person who was doing everything the research suggested, and something was still missing. It took me longer than I would like to admit to start asking the right question. Not what are you doing for your body, but who are you doing it with? There is a finding in the research on aging and physical decline that almost never makes it into the conversation about mobility and muscle. Not because it is obscure, the evidence has been accumulating for decades. It has been published in major journals. It has been replicated across populations and cultures and age groups. It almost never makes it into the conversation because it doesn't fit neatly into the categories we use when we talk about physical health. It isn't about exercise. It isn't about nutrition. It isn't about sleep or stress or any of the variables that populate the standard checklist of healthy aging. It is about something that most people would not think to mention to their doctor, and something their doctor would not think to ask about. The evidence increasingly suggests that loneliness may influence muscle loss directly, not only through the behaviors that lonely people tend to adopt, but through physiology itself. Not as a side effect, not as a consequence of reduced activity or disrupted sleep, though both of those matter too. Through mechanisms that researchers are still mapping, but that the data across multiple studies and populations consistently points toward. The body, it turns out, does not only listen to what you ask of it physically, it listens to the world you are living in. And a body living in prolonged isolation may receive a signal, quiet, consistent, and difficult to override with exercise alone, that changes how it maintains itself. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you may change the way you think about every conversation we've had on this channel so far. I want to tell you about a woman named Dorothy. She was 71 years old when she first came to see me, retired teacher, the kind of person who had spent 40 years in classrooms, surrounded by noise and need and the particular energy of young people who required something from her every day. She had loved it, not in the way people say they loved their work when they're being polite, in the way that makes leaving feel like a kind of amputation. She retired at 68. Her husband had died 2 years before. Her children were grown and scattered, one in Seattle, one in London, one close enough to visit on holidays, but not close enough to be present in the ordinary way that matters. She was not, by any clinical measure, in crisis. She was simply alone in a way she had never been before. She came to me not because of loneliness. She would not have used that word. She came because of her knees. They were stiff in the mornings, slow to respond, the kind of resistance that hadn't been there 2 years ago and was now simply part of how she began each day. She had assumed it was age. She had assumed it was the natural progression of a body moving through its 70s. She had done what intelligent, self-aware people do when they believe a process is inevitable. She had accommodated it. I asked her the questions I always ask: sleep, nutrition, movement, medications, the standard inventory of variables that shape physical function in someone her age. Her answers were reasonable across the board, not perfect. Nobody's answers are perfect, but nothing that explained the degree of change she was describing. And then I asked the question I had learned, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, to include. I asked her about her days, not her symptoms, not her habits, her days, who she saw, where she went, whether there were people in her life who expected something from her, who noticed when she was present and would notice if she wasn't. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "I think I've become invisible." Not sadly, not dramatically, the way someone states a fact they have been living with long enough that the emotion has worn smooth. I've become invisible. She didn't mean it literally. She meant that the social world that had organized her life for 40 years, the classrooms, the colleagues, the parents, the children who needed her, had dissolved. And what had replaced it was a life that was comfortable and quiet and, in some important sense, without witness. Nobody was watching her move through the world. Nobody needed her to show up. Nobody would notice in the immediate and daily way that matters if she stayed home instead. And her body, I have come to believe, knew this. Not consciously, not in any way she could have pointed to or named, but at the level where the body makes its quiet calculations about what is required of it and what it can afford to let go. Her body had registered the change. Let me tell you what the research actually shows, not the emotional logic of it, though the emotional logic is real and it matters. The physiology, the mechanism, the reason why what Dorothy was experiencing in her body was not a coincidence. Researchers began noticing something unusual. People who describe themselves as chronically lonely, not occasionally solitary, but persistently, lastingly disconnected from the social world around them, often carried a different biological signature. Higher levels of inflammation, not enough to make them feel sick, not enough to show up as a diagnosis or appear on a standard blood panel as something requiring treatment, but enough to quietly change the environment their muscles were living in. The body, it turns out, keeps score in ways the conscious mind never sees. The second thing researchers found was cortisol. Chronic loneliness activates the body's stress response, not dramatically, not in the way that a sudden threat activates it, persistently, at a low level that the conscious mind may barely register, but that the body registers continuously. The result is a stress hormone, cortisol, maintained at higher baseline levels over time. Cortisol, in the short term, is essential. It mobilizes energy, it sharpens attention, it prepares the body to respond to whatever is coming. But cortisol, over the long term, is catabolic. It breaks tissue down, and muscle tissue is particularly vulnerable. Here is the part that I keep returning to. The body was designed for periods of isolation, brief ones, the kind that ends when the tribe returns, when the danger passes, when the separation resolves. It was never designed for permanent isolation. And when isolation persists long enough, the body begins to interpret it as a form of threat, not a dramatic threat, a quiet one, a persistent one, the kind that keeps cortisol elevated, not in a spike, but in a tide, low, constant, wearing. A body that feels persistently unsafe is a body that is quietly, continuously working against its own muscle mass. The third pathway is perhaps the simplest and the most overlooked: movement, not the deliberate movement of an exercise program. The spontaneous, incidental, unremarkable movement that fills a socially connected life without anyone thinking of it as exercise. The walk to meet a friend, the trip to a gathering that required getting dressed and leaving the house, the physical presence in a room full of other people that produces, almost without effort, more movement than an afternoon alone ever would. Getting dressed because someone is expecting you. That last one matters more than it sounds, because expectation creates movement, obligation creates movement. Being needed in the ordinary, daily, completely unremarkable way that a social life generates creates movement that no exercise program can fully replicate. And that movement, accumulated across a day, across a week, across months and years, sends a signal. A quiet, consistent, believable signal that says, we are still needed here, keep the body ready. Its absence sends a different signal entirely. These three pathways, inflammation, cortisol, and the quiet disappearance of incidental movement, do not operate separately. They interact, they reinforce each other. The biology of loneliness is not a single mechanism. It is a cascade. And at the end of that cascade, in bodies that have been living in sustained isolation for long enough, is something measurable, something the research, across multiple studies and populations, consistently finds. accelerated loss of muscle mass and function, not because the lonely person did something wrong, not because they failed to send the right signal, but because the world around them stopped sending one. Dorothy came back 3 months after that first appointment. She sat down differently than she used to. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious to anyone who didn't know her, but I noticed it before she said anything. Something had shifted. The quality of how she moved into the room, the way she settled into the chair, without the careful, negotiated attention that had characterized the way she arrived the first time. I didn't say anything. I waited. She had started with something small. A reading group at the local library. Wednesday mornings, 8 people, most of them around her age, gathered around a table to discuss a book they had all read the week before. She had gone the first time reluctantly. A neighbor had mentioned it. She had no particular reason to say yes and no particular reason to say no. So she went. She told me about the second week, not the book. The moment when she walked in and one of the women at the table, a woman she had met only once, looked up and said simply, "Oh good, you came back." 3 words. You came back. She said she had thought about those 3 words more than she expected to, not because they were remarkable, because they weren't, because they were exactly the kind of thing people say without thinking. The ordinary social acknowledgement that someone's presence was noticed, that their absence would have been noticed too. She had not realized, until that moment, how long it had been since anyone had said something like that to her. By the end of the second month, she was also walking, not as exercise, as transportation. The library was 12 minutes from her house. She walked there on Wednesday mornings because someone was expecting her. She didn't think of it as exercise. She didn't think of it as a health intervention. She thought of it as getting to the reading group on time. But her body didn't experience them as different things. Her body knew only that there was a reason to move, a destination, a room where her presence was expected and her absence would be noted. And somewhere in the quiet machinery of her physiology, in the inflammatory markers and the cortisol levels and the spontaneous movement that now filled her Wednesdays in a way her Wednesdays hadn't been filled before, something began to change. She mentioned the knees almost as an aside. The stiffness in the mornings was less. Not gone. She was 71, and some stiffness is simply part of being 71, but less. The resistance that had been there every morning for 2 years had softened. She hadn't changed her diet. She hadn't started a new exercise program. She hadn't taken any new medications. She had joined a reading group. I want to be careful here. I am not telling you that a reading group cures joint stiffness. I am not telling you that social connection is a substitute for the physical work that maintaining a body in its 70s genuinely requires. What I'm telling you is what Dorothy's body seemed to understand before her conscious mind caught up to it, that the signal the body needs to maintain itself is not only physical, it is social, it is ancient. It is the signal that human bodies have been receiving and depending on for as long as human beings have lived in groups. You are still part of the tribe. Stay strong. You are still needed. That signal arriving through the ordinary channels of a social life, through the Wednesday morning walk, through the table at the library, through a woman looking up and saying, "Oh good, you came back," is not a metaphor for physical maintenance. It is physical maintenance, delivered in the language the body has understood longest. Dorothy is not the exception. That is perhaps the most important thing the research shows. What happened in her body, the quiet shift in inflammation, in cortisol, in the incidental movement that began filling her Wednesdays again, is not a remarkable individual response to an unusual intervention. It is a pattern, documented across populations, replicated in studies that measured not inflammation or cortisol, but the things that actually matter to people living their lives. Researchers have measured this in different ways: walking speed, grip strength, frailty, recovery after illness, mortality. Again and again, across these different measures, one pattern appears. People who remain socially connected tend to remain physically capable for longer. Study after study has found the same pattern. Older adults who remain socially connected tend to lose strength more slowly. They remain physically independent for longer. They recover better when illness arrives, and they are less likely to enter the downward spiral of frailty that turns ordinary tasks into difficult ones. Dorothy's reading group was not incidental to her recovery. It was part of the mechanism. The researchers were careful with their language, as scientists should be, but the direction of the evidence was remarkably consistent. The body maintains itself differently when it believes it is still part of something. We often talk about exercise as if it begins with motivation, as if the missing ingredient for the person who knows they should move more, who understands the research, who has heard the arguments and accepted them, is simply the will to begin. But motivation rarely appears out of nowhere. More often, it appears because life asks something of us. Think about the times in your life when you moved most naturally, not because you had decided to exercise, not because you had committed to a program or set a goal or made a resolution, but because somewhere, someone was expecting you. A friend waiting at the corner at 7 in the morning. You were there, not because you felt motivated, because she was waiting. A walking group that meets every Tuesday, regardless of weather. You went. Not because you particularly wanted to face the cold, because they would notice if you didn't. A grandchild whose face appears at the window when your car pulls into the driveway. You got up from the chair, not because your knees felt ready, because someone was watching for you. A seat at a table in a library on Wednesday mornings. You walked there because the seat was yours, because someone would look up when you arrived. None of these are exercise programs. All of them produce movement, and more than movement, they produce the particular quality of movement that carries the signal the body needs. Not effortful movement, not disciplined movement, expected movement. The movement of a body that is going somewhere because somewhere is waiting for it. This is why the research on social connection and physical decline is so difficult to act on in the conventional way. You cannot prescribe being expected. You cannot bottle the feeling of a friend at the corner at 7 in the morning. You cannot manufacture the particular pull of a room where your coat belongs on a specific chair. What you can do, and what the research increasingly suggests matters enormously, is build the structures that generate that feeling. Not the feeling itself, the architecture that makes the feeling possible. A commitment that involves another person, a role that requires your physical presence, a place where your absence would be noticed. The opposite of loneliness is not company. It is being expected somewhere. That distinction is easy to miss, but it changes the question entirely. The problem is not that you need more friends. The problem may be that there is nowhere your presence is required. You may need a Wednesday. Most people think muscle is built in the gym, and it is. Progressive resistance, consistent demand. The signal sent repeatedly, believably, over time. Everything we've talked about on this channel is real and it matters. But that is not the whole story. Muscle is also built by having somewhere to go. Someone to help, a reason to get dressed, a reason to leave the house, a reason to stay ready. I've been practicing medicine for more than 2 decades, and one of the things I've learned, slowly and with some resistance, because it doesn't fit neatly into the categories medical training provides, is that the body is not only a physical system responding to physical inputs, it is a social animal. Ancient, deeply wired, exquisitely sensitive to signals about its place in the world, and it maintains itself accordingly. When I look back at the patients who have aged most successfully, not the ones who were the most disciplined, not the ones with the most rigorous programs, but the ones whose bodies remained most capable for the longest time, I notice something they tend to have in common, not a particular exercise, not a particular diet, a particular kind of life. A life that required something of them, a life that had texture and obligation and the daily experience of being needed by something beyond themselves. A life, in other words, that kept sending the signal. We are not designed for a life without witness. That is not a metaphor. It is biology. Tens of thousands of years of evolution shaped the human body to function within a social group, to be seen, to be needed, to be missed when absent. The body that is witnessed maintains itself differently than the body that is not because of willpower, not because of discipline, because the signal it receives about its place in the world is different, and the body, faithful, efficient, responsive as it has always been, responds to that signal the way it responds to every signal it receives consistently and believes. It prepares, it maintains, it stays ready. I think about the women and men I have sat across from over the years who were doing everything right and still losing ground. And I think about the question I learned too late to ask sooner. Not what are you doing for your body, but where does your coat belong? That question, small, domestic, entirely unmedical, may be one of the most important questions in the conversation about aging well. Because the coat that has somewhere to go belongs to a body that has somewhere to go. And a body that has somewhere to go is a body that is still receiving the signal it was built to receive. We still need this. Keep it ready. The last time I saw Dorothy, she spent very little time talking about her knees. She talked about the next book. The group had just finished something, and there was a disagreement about what to read next. She described it with the particular animation of someone who has opinions and knows that her opinions are welcome. She was 72. A year had passed since that first appointment. She still had some stiffness in the mornings. She probably always would. 72 is 72. But the stiffness was no longer the first thing she mentioned. She had other things to talk about now. She had a Wednesday. The body listens, not only to exercise, not only to protein, not only to sleep. It listens for evidence that life still requires it. It listens for the signal that has been arriving through the ordinary channels of a social life for as long as human beings have lived in groups. You are still part of this. Stay ready. You are still needed here. The opposite of loneliness is not company. It is being expected somewhere. So if you're wondering what to do for your muscles this week, find your Wednesday. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Thank you for spending this time with me. Subscribe to the channel. I hope to meet you again tomorrow.